What's up, guys? Pat Healy here outside 5th Street Gym with Coach Guy Laieta. Thanks for joining, man. Appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I promised you for a long time.
Yeah, we finally got you on. And for the people listening and watching right now, we're going to talk on this podcast. It's going to be a little bit more of a crime and boxing podcast. I think there's some interesting stories, especially with Guy's background in New York. Why don't you tell the people a little bit about your background and your life really in New York with N.Y.P.D boxing and being a detective and kind of how that all came to be.
I started out as a boxer when I was a teenager. I was turning pro very young. Had a great coach and a manager, and I had a spinal injury, ended my boxing career, so I switched to coaching. And my college education is in journalism because I was going to become a boxing writer because I'm a boxing historian. But somewhere along the line, I decided I wanted to be a policeman. And I felt like I would be much better at that than as a writer. So I wound up becoming a New York City cop, and I called up the Police Benevolent Association and said, hey, I heard you guys have a boxing team. I have a lot of knowledge. And they were like, yeah, come on over. So I was one of the coaches on the police boxing team, and we went to England. We fought the Bobbies and beat them, and it was a great experience. They were really nice. Their opponents of our cops after they fought, they would take them out on patrol with them the next day. And it was very nice. So it was nice coaching the police boxing team. But when I became a detective, which was shortly after that, I really didn't have the time. And I wanted to coach boxing full-time, which is hard to do. So I moved to Florida and opened my own detective business. My partner and I have Law and Order Investigations, and we do mostly homicide cases. But it allowed me the opportunity to coach boxers. So I started with PALs and had dozens of Golden Glove champions. And then when the 5th Street Gym opened up like 12 years ago, I called and I talked to Dino, who's now my partner, my friend. We just hit it off and we started training fighters together.
Yeah, and you still got the amateur fighters at the gym, the pro guys. You're with N.Y.P.D recently, who just got another strap, the WBC silver over in Latvia. So that must be exciting for you to be along with his journey as well.
Yeah, I spend most of my time training him because he's close to a world title fight now. Actually, he's been promised the next world title fight. So I have some amateurs here, but they're mostly working guys that do it as a hobby.
Right.
So it's not like 16-year-old amateurs that are going to be Olympians. They're more working guys that just love doing it, and I love helping them.
You're the best. Well, let's get into the crime and boxing part of this podcast. Obviously, with your background as a detective, we were talking a little bit off camera about some of the cases where, things have gone wrong in the boxing realm. And I know there's one story that kind of sticks out that we want to talk to a little bit today. So
there's been a lot of criminal cases in boxing, like going back to the great Stanley Ketchel, who was a great middleweight champion, like in Jack Johnson era. He was murdered, by a jealous ranch hand. He supposedly was, fooling around with the wrong woman. And cases after that where guys became like Jack Blackburn, the great coach of one of the greatest heavyweight champions, Joe Louis. Jack Blackburn was actually locked up for murder twice. Somehow beat the rap and got out. And not only was he a great fighter, but he coached one of the greatest fighters of all time, Joe Louis. Then there was Tony Ayala, when I was growing up, was a great fighter that was going to be world champion. He was 19 or 20 years old, and he got locked up for rape and burglary and did like almost 20 years in jail. Still came out, and then he made a comeback, and he was still pretty good, but he was old. But the case that was sticking out in my mind that we never hear much about, it was a very unfortunate case, was James Butler, who people will remember the incident on ESPN. It was about 20 years ago. I think it was 2001. And he was awaiting the decision, which he clearly lost. And he went over to his opponent barehanded and sucker punched him. And he got arrested, and I believe he went to Rikers Island and for maybe 6 months. I mean, not enough.
I remember seeing the old clip of that. It was like a devastating, sucker
terrible.
punch, and then the announcers. I don't know if it was Teddy Atlas at the time, but
It was.
yeah, I remember the clips of him saying, arrest this guy. This is assault. Forget about the ban on boxing. This guy needs to go away for what he just did.
Yeah, and he was right, but he didn't go away long enough. And then I found out that when he got out of jail, I didn't even know Max Kellerman had a brother, but Max Kellerman, the commentator's brother, was I believe he was a freelance sports writer, and I guess a real good guy. And he took this guy in because James Butler had nowhere to go. But I believe he understood it was going to be briefly, and James Butler didn't want to leave. And I believe Max Kellerman's brother told him, you got to go. Next thing you know, James Butler murdered Max Kellerman's brother. And I believe they gathered the evidence. I think it was 2004. Then he wound up getting convicted to like 30 years, which isn't enough.
No. And it's interesting, obviously a horrific story. Kellerman at the time, early 2000s, I was a little kid. So you'll know, you know better than me. Kellerman at the time, he wasn't really Kellerman of boxing.
I mean, for boxing people, we knew him because he was on ESPN doing color commentary for boxing. So I didn't know his brother.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I never heard of his brother until he got murdered. But Max Kellerman was already coming up doing the Friday Night Fights with Teddy, I believe, at that time. And it's just a terrible story and just another example of a fighter who was pretty good. I mean, he wasn't like Tony Ayala's wasted talent of going to prison for 20 years, but he's a pretty good fighter and, destroyed some young man's life, killed him, and also is in jail forever.
Yeah, horrible story. I mean, there's so many lives that are saved from boxing. So it's obviously terrible to see.
Way more saved.
So, and going back to when you're in New York, right, with the N.Y.P.D, I know the N.Y.P.D Cops and Kids gym in New York, and a lot of work they do with the young kids. And maybe there's times where, I'm sure you were around a lot of guys through the years of your experience in boxing where you saw many people that were saved by the sport, right?
I did, and growing up too, but a lot of kids could have went the wrong way and they wound up becoming boxers. A lot of champs were, like Jake LaMotta was a juvenile delinquent, became a great middleweight champion. Rocky Graziano did time. Hector Camacho, who was an amateur when I was, he went to Rikers Island briefly, I believe for car theft, wound up becoming a great champion, and then getting killed, I think, in a drug deal. So a lot of guys go back to crime.
Well, this is an interesting thing I want to talk about is Sonny Liston. So Sonny Liston, I think, tragic end to his life, his story. He was marked as this bad guy, right? And he was kind of the muscle for organized crime. And it eventually, led to his demise through drugs and drinking. And most likely he was murdered, correct? I believe they said it was an overdose, but it looked like a strangulation or something in a Vegas hotel room. Is there anything that you've ever heard around that or theories about what happened?
The only thing is, I find it hard to believe that Sonny Liston got overpowered by anybody. I know supposedly he was afraid of needles and he died of a heroin overdose, but I also can't picture anybody overpowering Sonny Liston.
Yeah.
I feel bad for Sonny Liston. I'm a big fan. I mean, he's before my time, but I really believe Sonny Liston was just this misunderstood guy. He couldn't read or write. His father used to abuse him. He moved to St. Louis, I believe, following his mom, who had left, and then he got involved with street crime. I mean, I'm not making excuses for him because being uneducated is not an excuse to break the law. But I think by time when he went to jail and this priest befriended him and got him involved in boxing, when he came out, right away the mob mob jumped on him. Back then, boxing was really dirty. Right. Boxing's always been dirty, but back then it was totally mob controlled. And they basically signed him, and he had to do whatever they said. So I really felt bad when he won the title from Floyd Patterson, and he was expecting there to be a bunch of people waiting for him at the airport, and there was
so
nobody
sad.
there.
I remember seeing a documentary on him, and they touched on that, and it's really just a tragic story. It's unfortunate that he was labeled as that bad guy, even if he was to an extent.
It seems like he wanted to not be a bad guy.
Yeah, everyone was like, no, you're the bad guy.
Yeah, you're a bad guy no matter what.
But interesting around his death. But going to the organized crime involved in boxing and how the sports, of course, had a very dirty history. Around the judging at that time to now, do you think it's more incompetence, or do you think it's more, there's been some very controversial decisions? How involved do you think, or how corrupt do you think some of these judges are today?
Sometimes you watch a fight and you think the judges had to bet. Like Tim Bradley, Manny Pacquiao. Manny Pacquiao probably won 11 rounds, and they gave it to Bradley. Well, I love Tim Bradley, but you would assume by watching the fight that it was corruption. But being involved in so many fights and talking to these judges, I think a lot of it's incompetence. I just don't think they know how to score fights.
Why is that? Like, what, is it just...
There aren't that many people that are into boxing, first of all. So, you should use people that have been involved in the sport.
Right.
When I was coaching amateurs, I was also judging just to help out with USA Boxing. And there were people there that were doing it because they wanted to get into professional boxing as judges. But amateur boxing at the time was just clicking the punches that you thought landed. And then I see some of these judges on TV in Florida that, they really don't understand boxing. Some judges are outstanding, don't get me wrong, but a lot of them are just incompetent.
So I have a question and sort of a comment for you. The WBC, maybe you could correct me on this, but a lot of people have talked about open scoring, where after the round, the fighter knows if they're up or they're down, what's going on. Right?
I'll give you an example.
But the WBC, I believe, did that at one point.
We just fought in Latvia 3 weeks ago. Noel McCallion beat Yuri Kalenga for the WBC silver belt. And after 4 rounds, like 2 of the judges had it even. I swear.
Did you know this? Was it open?
Yeah. They showed it after the 4th and after the 8th.
So the WBC does do that on some
They did it that day. It was the first fight I've ever been involved with.
I've heard about that.
But to give you an example, he won every round. And there were 2 judges that had it even. And Dino and I, my partner, we were talking to one of the judges the next day in the restaurant. And he goes, I gave your guy 11 rounds. And I go, out of curiosity, what round did you give to Kalenga? He goes, the first one. I'm like, well, in the first round, he didn't land a punch. So basically, some judges give these guys rounds just because they're moving forward.
Yeah.
And that's silly.
Ring control and...
aggression is not enough if you're walking into punches, which Kalenga was.
What are your thoughts on open scoring? Like, the two-sided argument are... let the fighters know, because if they're getting robbed midway through the fight, they can at least try to attempt to go for the finish. Then on the other side, people say, well, if a guy knows he's 6 rounds up, he's just going to coast, and it's bad for the sport because then guys are just coasting out and just playing it safe for the win if they know they're up. Which side are you on?
Well, the answer is I agree on both. If I were up after 8 rounds to nothing, I would just stick and move for the last 4 rounds. So I understand that. But I think it's good to show, probably better to do open scoring, because at least you could see that some of the judges are either blind or in the tank. If you see one guy's getting knocked from pillar to post and then you're holding them responsible. But what I would really like to see with judges is, after a questionable decision, bring them into the boxing commissioner's office the next day or the following Monday, and have them watch it and explain why they gave this particular fight in that particular round. I'd like to see that, and hold judges accountable that way. Because sometimes, look, in all fairness to the judges, sometimes where you're sitting, if the fighter's back is to you and the other guy's throwing punches, you can't see.
Yeah.
So, but I would like to see them called into the boxing commissioner's office and explain this one.
I'm with that 100%. I think there needs to be way more pressure on the judges, especially recently with Josh Taylor and Catterall. I think most people would say that Josh Taylor lost. He ended up getting the decision in his hometown of Scotland. Probably some home cooking going on there, and it's terrible because Catterall, no one knows him. If you're not a hardcore boxing fan, no one knows who he is. Now, no one's going to know him in a month. He's going to fade away. Josh Taylor's going up to 147. It's a shame. It's really robbing him of a moment where he could become undisputed at his division, holding all the belts.
Machuno just fought Makabu, and he clearly won the fight, Machuno, and they gave it to Makabu.
And who's behind that promotion? Don King.
Don King was the promoter. I'm not saying anything.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt you. I'll cut this out, but leave that into, since it's becoming more a general talk, then leave that into maybe fights through history where the judges...
Bad decisions? Oh, yeah, okay.
Bad decisions, which ones you thought may have...
Oh, I could run with it.
So you were just talking about the Makabu fight. Obviously, he got a gift, right? And Don King is the promoter of that event. He's no stranger to controversy with crime surrounding himself. I believe he's has murdered someone and he's gotten away with it. But talk to me about maybe the corruption around some of his events, right? There's got to be a lot of questionable decisions.
I'm not singling out Don King, but let's look at it this way. If you're a promoter, and I don't mean Don King, I mean any promoter, and you have access to the judges, and now you're having dinner with them, and you're setting them up in 5-star hotels, okay? A lot of times, those judges are inclined to side with your fighter because they want to get called again to judge a fight. Now, think of it if you're Major League Baseball or the NFL, and you're Bill Belichick before the Super Bowl, and you're dining with the referees. Wouldn't that be absurd?
Definitely.
In boxing, this is what goes on. So I'm not saying Don King. I'm saying it's rampant with many promoters. You know, it's available to them. That's why we've seen so many bad decisions.
Right. And that's just the problem with the sport. I mean, I don't know. It's almost not even worth getting into because we all know that the sport is so fractured in terms of different promoters, different networks. So there's always going to be an A side and a B side until things can kind of be united into one umbrella like the NFL or like the UFC, where there's one sanctioning body, one sanctioning place. There's always going to be an upper hand.
Yeah, I don't think it'll ever happen, but it would be great. Teddy Atlas called for it for years.
Right.
You know, and he's right, 1,000%. He's always right. I would like to see him be the commissioner.
Yeah.
Because he's honest to a fault, which is great. But if, like the way Dana White runs MMA, I mean, he doesn't run MMA, but he runs UFC, which is the main organization. And no, I mean, maybe the fighters don't get paid what they should, but the good fighters have to fight good fighters. So you don't see the bad decisions as much in MMA as you do in boxing.
Right. And what do you think about I'm curious, from the old school boxing to now, taking it to 12 rounds?
Oh, I like 15 rounds better.
I do too.
Because
I think some of the best rounds are...
I mean, I think 15 rounds is better because there's been so many championships throughout history that were won in the 13th, 14th, 15th round. Right. When I hear the announcers now saying the championship rounds, the 11th and 12th rounds, I kind of cringe. Because the championship rounds were always 13, 14, 15. So...
That's like a fight that comes into mind for me recently, or fairly recently, is Teofimo Lopez versus Lomachenko. And Teofimo won that fight, I believe. But if that was 15 rounds, things were clearly starting to flow the other way. I just feel like it kind of takes momentum away.
I scored it 6 rounds apiece, but Teofimo won the 12th round.
He did.
Yeah, he won the 12th round.
But the last 4
Lomachenko
out of 5.
won 5 out of the last 6.
Yeah, right.
But
things were trending his way.
I just think Lomachenko was injured that day.
Yeah.
I think he was injured. He had surgery, I think, on his shoulder after the fight.
Yeah, he did.
So, but I scored it 6 rounds apiece. So did Andre Ward. So I'm not alone.
No.
You know?
You're not.
I'm a big fan of Lomachenko, so I was questioning myself, am I being unfair? But Andre Ward had it scored exactly the same way I did.
So obviously Teofimo won the fight. He then went on to fight Kambosos, pulled off an amazing upset, crazy performance in Teofimo's backyard in New York. And now we have Loma. Everything we'll see. Obviously, he's in the Ukraine right now, but hopefully that fight happens soon.
It's interesting because that's what makes boxing great. Teofimo beat a fighter more talented than him, and then Kambosos beat a fighter more talented than him. So the best guy doesn't always win.
Who do you see standing at the lightweight division once this all filters out? Because we got Gervonta Davis floating around.
I still think Lomachenko is the best fighter in the world. It's just that not everybody is suited to move up in weight effectively. I think Lomachenko is the best fighter in the world, but I just think he's really a featherweight.
Yeah.
And
he is small.
He's small, but I think Lomachenko is still the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world.
Well, I appreciate the time, Coach Guy here. I think it was a fun episode. Hopefully you enjoyed it.
I did.
And you guys will all be checking this out soon on audio or YouTube dropping. Make sure to go follow the Fifth Street Gym, follow me, Brooklyn Boxing Podcast, and subscribe on YouTube at The Pod Matrix. Thanks, Guy.
The Pod Matrix.